wanted to have a little bit of fun and build something that's not only cool looking, but can be used for decorative purposes. How about a wooden chain? Now this is a really simple project, and if you do it just right, unless somebody's looking for the seams, you won't easily see them. Let me show you how to put this together. The first thing we need is a nice clean piece of lumber. If you notice on this board here, this is a 2x6. It has very little knots. One there, one on the end there. You want this to be nice and clean as possible so those knots don't cause problems. Now, of course, if you want a little bit smaller than a 2x6, you can go with a 1x4, and I'll show you a little bit more on how to do this in a little bit. Now, whatever wood we work with, we want to make sure we've got the thickness of the board. For example, in this case, it's 1.5. You want to make sure that the thickness or the width of the walls of your chain are also 1.5. For example, looking at this completed piece here, you'll notice the 1.5 is very similar in size to the 1.5 here. It may not be 100% perfect, and that's okay, but you do want it to be pretty close so it looks pretty much symmetrical. And to make this really simple for you, I've actually calculated out the numbers so we have everything as symmetrical as possible and it'll look really good. So as we're doing this, I'll just give you the numbers so you don't have to do any math. First things first is we want to draw a straight line down the center of a board. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be perfect. There's going to be a little bit of waste on each side of your board here. So as long as you can get it pretty close. For example, if you want to try and avoid the knot that might be right there, you can always shift this over just a little bit to one side, but just trying to get it as close to center as possible. And so you don't have to do any math. The center of a 2x6 is 2 3/4. Next up is to find and to mark the centers of the holes for each of the links. The first one is 2 3/8. And the second one is 5 3/4. Then we need to use a compass. For example, this right here is a heavy duty version that I like to use in my shop, but you don't have to have one as fancy as this. You can have the old plastic school versions if you'd like, but just make sure that the lock on it, whenever you have it to your own dimensions, that the lock is nice and tight so it doesn't move, because we want this to be as symmetrical as possible. And yes, I know I've said the word symmetrical a few times, and I might say it again, but the main reason is by making sure everything matches up, that kind of takes your mind away from it's just wood and looks more realistic like a chain. Now it's time to set up the dimension for your compass here, and you want it to be from the pivot point to your pencil 2 3/8. Remember, that was the first measurement of the wood, so make sure that it matches that as well. Then take the compass and find the pivot point, and you want to put it right on that 2 3/8 mark that you did earlier. And once it's there, it's a good idea to kind of press down a little bit. Creates a little bit of a divot in the wood, and that way it doesn't move around on you. Then you just want to trace out that circle. Once you get done with that circle, take your pivot point and move it over to your 5 3/4. Push down a little bit to create that divot, and then do the same thing. Next, we want to take a straight edge or a ruler and find the two highest peaks of our circles here, and then you want to connect those together with another line. And then do the same at the top. Before we get into cutting, let's actually look at the rest of the board. You can see that there's plenty of room here that we can draw out these shapes, circles, and lines. So let's go ahead and do that, and that way when we get to the cutting stage, we can kind of batch everything out in groups. As we go to make our marks, remember we need a little bit of space in between this circle and the next one so there's room to make a cut. So move over about 1/8 of an inch or so, and then remember to do 2 3/8 and 5 3/4. Next up, I'm going to use the miter saw to cut out each of these sections. It's just a little bit easier to work some of the future and following steps with each of these sections a little bit smaller instead of trying to wield around a very large piece of wood. Now I'm going to cut the holes for our links, and to do that I'm going to use a 2-inch Forstner bit. Now that little divot that we created earlier with our compass, as long as we find the center of our Forstner bit right there in the center of that little divot, then it should be symmetrical on both sides. I'm going to use this Forstner bit in a drill press for 2 reasons. First, it's a little bit easier just to make sure that the holes are straight up and down through our wood. And number 2, well, having a 2-inch Forstner bit in a hand drill, that can be a little bit overpowering, so please be careful. I'm also going to have a sacrificial board under the piece that we're cutting so that the Forstner bit doesn't come in contact with the base. Also, it should have a cleaner cut. And just a heads up, even with dust collection, this is a very messy cut. After drilling those holes, I'm now going to cut out the outside profile of this chain link. I'm going to use a bandsaw to do this, but if you don't have a bandsaw, that's okay. You can use a jigsaw or whatever else you could like to cut that out. So just trim out this outside, get it real close to that line. I'm next going to use a sanding wheel on this link to sand all around those rough edges to make sure this is nice and as smooth as possible and right up to the edge of that line. Once the outside profile is nice and smooth, I'm taking it over to my router. Now I have a 3/8 inch round over bit in here, and I'm going to trim out the inside and the outside profiles. And just remember to do the round over on the top and the bottom. Then I'm going to use an orbital sander just to knock off the pencil marks, any factory marks that might be on the wood. And if there's any extra rough edges, it'd probably be a good idea to hand sand that just to make sure everything stays nice and smooth. Now this link is done and ready to be assembled, but we need some of these links that actually come apart so we can interlink them, and that requires a few extra steps. I've cut out 3 of these and I want to interlink these together, and to do that I'm actually going to take one of these over to my bandsaw and cut lengthwise all the way down it. And the reason why I'm going lengthwise is it's going with the grain, and because the grain is already going in that direction, it kind of takes your eyes off any imperfections that are going in the same direction, which makes it a little bit easier to hide. Now I don't recommend going across the grain because that's going to be really easy for your eyes to pick up, because you can tell really easily when something's not right going with the grain, and your eyes will detect it. So make sure you go with the grain. Now of course, if you don't have a bandsaw, you could possibly do this with a jigsaw. Just make sure you have a thin blade and you cut it as straight as possible because you want this to match up nicely. At this point, this is where a lot of the woodworkers would disagree. Some say glue it together, it's strong enough, and others would say put a dowel or some kind of support going through it. Now, I kind of stand with the just glue it together. I think it'll be strong enough, but let me show you what I mean with the dowels. Now here's one with dowels and one without. Now, when you're not using dowels, all you're depending upon is the shear strength of the glue. And with the dowels, it allows wood to go all the way across and just gives that a little additional support. Now the dowels definitely do add strength compared to just the sheer strength of the glue, but just remember, these are more for decorative. I wouldn't dare try and hang anything real heavy or try and pull with these because it's just wood, you'll break them. So just the sheer strength of the glue alone should be strong enough. And one more thing before gluing them, let's line everything up on your table here, getting it as straight as possible. And then I'm going to do just a light line going across where they've been cut. This will just allow it a little bit easier to line up later when we're gluing it together. As we go to glue these together, we just want just a little tiny bit of glue on each of these because we don't want a ton of squeeze out when everything is pushed together. Then just take your finger and spread out the glue. We want it to touch as much surface as possible. But again, if it's too much glue, go ahead and wipe some of it away because we don't want a ton of squeeze out. Also, only put glue on one side, not the other, and that way when you put them together, it should attach and hold better. Then place the 2 corresponding pieces in position, and then flip your additional piece onto the top. We want to get everything as lined up as close as possible, and then we'll start adding clamps. I like to get the first clamp in place, just put a little bit of tension on it, not a lot, and then double check all of our lines that we did earlier just to make sure everything's lined up, reposition if necessary, and then tighten it down. And once the clamps are in place, then take some sandpaper and you want to go over each of the joints, making sure it go in a direction of the grain, and that way if there's any glue squeeze out, it'll use some of that sawdust down in there and make it kind of disappear. And once you give that glue some time to dry, just repeat that process a few more times and you can have a really cool looking wooden chain. Now I was wondering if this could work out, instead of running long ways with the grain, kind of go horizontal. And the solid pieces, they do work out. But unfortunately, when I tried to do the cuts and get everything together, because I'm going against the grain here, those lines stand out really big. Now if you're going to use this horizontal method, well, you do have to use much larger and wider pieces of wood. I think this was a 2x10 that I used to get this, so it's going to be a lot harder to wield stuff around. So I think I would stick with the 2x6 and the alignment of the grain. Now remember when I mentioned a 1x4 to get the smaller chain out of? Well, let me show you. Just like we used the thickness of the 2x to determine the thickness of our sides of our link, we're doing the same thing with the smaller 1x. This is roughly 3/4 of an inch, and we want this to be about 3/4 as well. And I did the math for you here as well. Moving from one of the sides, you go 1 3/16 for the first hole and 2 13/16 for the second hole. Now, making these smaller links, I would suggest a couple key changes. Instead of drawing everything out and then cutting each individual link out and then doing all the work that way, I'd suggest actually doing these in kind of a batch group. For example, get 3 or 4 on one board and let's work with that. This will allow us to have a little bit more control and keep our fingers a little bit further away when we're drilling the holes and using the router. And to make these center holes, we're going to use a 7/8 Forstner bit. When you get to the point where you need to router out the outer edge of your links, well, keeping your fingers this close to the blade is quite dangerous. So instead, I suggest getting a clamp. That way you can have full control and yet keep your fingers much further away. And just a reminder, when we go to cut these in half, you have to have a really thin blade, otherwise you'll remove too much material and they won't squeeze back together. Now, if by chance you don't have a blade that's thin enough, and when you go to cut these in half, there's just not enough room, let me show you a second way to make those linkable or those split pieces. Before we start drawing any lines or drilling any holes, let's first take our 1x4 and we want to rip it right down the center on the table saw. And that'll allow us to have 2 separate halves that we can clamp back together. And once we have it clamped together, making sure that everything is nice and flush, we then can draw everything out and drill out those holes, making sure that the centers of each of those holes are directly in the middle of those 2 pieces where they meet. Now, just like the big ones, we probably don't need dowels to actually assemble these back together, but considering there's a lot less material in between each of the pieces, I decided to try to drill out some of these just to see if it would work. Unfortunately, I had a lot of tear out, so it is possible, but just be prepared. You may have to remake a few of these in that process. And no matter which way you assemble your halves, once you get them ready, you glue them together just like you did with the larger versions. So now, whether you want a small chain or a very large wooden chain, that is a very simple way to put them together. Now, I hope you enjoyed this project. You can get out in your shop and have fun building.